This is a live mic check. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
You can go ahead and beam us up.
I'll just, if I just.
The light on that one's broken, but the mic works.
Very good, thank you.
We're on the air.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Growth Planning Committee of Kennebunkport. This is a comprehensive plan planning session. Today is January 14th, 2020, and I'd like to welcome everyone to the meeting. Before we get started, we always like to introduce our members and any guests we have, so we'll start down.
Warner Gilliam.
Mike Corsi.
James McMahon.
Jim Fitzgerald.
Barbara Barwise. Janet Powell.
Okay, and we have our consultants, Liz and Tom. Welcome. And who are you?
I'm Andrew Welch, Code Enforcement Officer, Kennebunkport.
Get out.
If you want me to, or...
Don't say that.
So, yeah, so,
Obviously, I haven't been in a lot of trouble with him.
You just set yourself up for failure.
I just did, didn't I?
It's good setting.
so Andrew beat me to the punch. I invited him to come to a meeting tonight. He's a recent hire with us. He's been with us, a couple of months now. And so invite him to come to growth planning and see what the comp plan update is all about, and have a chance to introduce him to you all and get a sense of what it is that we do here.
Very good.
Welcome.
Nice to meet you. Welcome.
We did cancel one meeting, but we do have minutes from the meeting of November 12th, 2019. Only myself, Barbara, and Janet can vote on these minutes. So I would like to make have a motion to accept the minutes.
Second.
All right, any discussion? All those in favor? They pass. Thank you very much. Sorry, guys, you got to be at the meeting. I'm going to give those back to you.
Thank you.
And Barbara, thank you very much for doing the minutes. Appreciate it. Okay, I guess we're going to get right into the prelude recap. How we want to do that?
Good evening, everyone. I'm going to do a quick recap of the Prelude event that we had in December. Tom and I were here for a few hours. We had a table set up, and we got a chance to talk to residents and visitors that were coming mostly to eat chili in here. We stopped them in their tracks and asked if anyone was interested in participating in our poster dot poll. And I have a couple of screenshots to show the results of the 2 posters that we had. We had 4 questions in total. What is your connection to Kennebunkport? What is your top concern related to natural resources? The top responses for those 2 questions were, I live in Kennebunkport year-round, followed by, I live in Kennebunkport for part of the year. Top concern related to natural resources was conservation land. We also asked about your top concern related to climate change, sea level rise, and coastal flooding. Came out in the lead on that question. It was raining quite a bit that day, and it was high tide while we were here, but we don't think that influenced people too much. And we also asked, what would you like to see more of in Kennebunkport? The choices were places to live, places to play, places to work, diversity of population, businesses and services for residents, and Kennebunkport doesn't need more of anything. And places to live came out on top there. So we included a short blog update on the website that has kind of a quick summary of the results to the dot poll, and then we have a more detailed write-up of the event that we'll be compiling into the public input document that will be completed as part of the comprehensive plan. So overall, it was pretty fun. Janet hung around for a while. James hung around for a while. So we appreciated their assistance and support.
I just ate chili.
It was good chili.
It was very good. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll do it again next year.
And thank you to the fire department for hosting us, and to everyone for participating. I think you completed the dot poll. Yeah, okay.
You also helped make the chili.
There you go.
Does anyone have any questions about that event? It was fun. We tried to get
I don't hear
people.
any surprises in there.
No, I don't think there's
No.
any surprises there. I mean, I think that's pretty consistent with some of the other surveys that we've sent out, kind of the.
Yeah, it was a good opportunity. We handed out some postcards, and it was a good opportunity just to spread the word a little bit more about the comprehensive plan update. So we had a good time. We tried to get people to only place 1 dot per question, but everyone wasn't always supervised, and so we had a range of, I think, 29 to high 40s on 1 question. So some people either didn't respond to all the questions or put a few too many dots down for themselves. But overall, I think most people did 1 dot per question. So next up, we wanted to quickly review the baseline report. This was on our agenda for December. So we want to have a chance to entertain any questions or have a short discussion on this baseline report before diving into what I think is the main highlight of our meeting tonight, which is the review of draft 1 of the historic resources chapter.
There you go.
Tom and I did this baseline report as an opportunity for ourselves to sort of summarize what we learned reviewing the 2012 comprehensive plan, some of the studies and information that was provided to us by the town. We learned a little bit more about the village parcel master plan from some of the information that's publicly available. We did a little bit of work looking at zoning districts, some of the dimensional standards, and the relation to the growth rate areas. And then we pulled out what we thought were the most pertinent land use specific strategies from the 2012 comprehensive plan. Those are in an appendix in the back of this baseline report, and that's something that we'll be revisiting as we go through the process of developing recommendations for this plan, to see if some of the recommendations from your 2012 plan have yet to be implemented, which ones still resonate with you, which ones you'd like to carry over to the 2030 plan. Any comments or questions, discussion items on that?
I thought this was excellent. This is a fantastic document, very, very well done. I wanted to just, one of the things that kind of popped out at me was the lack of a vision statement that we want to make sure, I think, gets in there, because that overarching vision statement for the whole town, I think that's really required. I also noticed in quite a few places where you have criteria rules that need to be followed from either the state or whatever. Were there a lot missing in 12, or is?
No,
Oh, okay.
Nope.
You guys are very thorough on 12.
Okay, good, good.
no,
'Cause
we
I-
just included those as sort of guidance of the types of information that will be included in, that were included, should be included, and will be included in this update.
And Jim, in response to your comment about the vision, we agree it's very important. Our plan was to engage a much larger audience coming
Oh,
here.
absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
And we really need their input in order to get a vision that reflects the communities. So we didn't forget about it, we just waited for that.
Oh, no, it's not that I wasn't expecting it. What I thought was great is you identified the lack of one. And I think it's very important that we do have one, so. Are there any other questions from anyone?
I mean, I think a lot of the points in terms of, some of the questions that we were looking at, you'll find some areas that the previous plan was silent, and, I think in some of those cases, it's not because nobody thought to discuss it, it's because it may have been a topic of controversy that got pulled out, that might have been addressed in 2000, because we had two other versions. We had a 2003 version and a 2005 version before we had the 2012 version. So, not to throw any other versions out there for you, but, it might be helpful, and I can get copies of those if you want to take an overview and see what didn't, what passed at the state level, but what didn't pass with residents.
We are very mindful that at the end of the day, we want a document that's gonna be approved at town meeting.
Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
Yeah, so I can make sure to get, those
Can
versions
be a
that,
challenge.
that you can
That'll be
take a look at.
Oh, that would be great.
Right.
And we know that the village partial discussion is ongoing, so our review is sort of static based on
Yeah.
the information available at the time, but
Yeah,
will be updated
yeah.
as we,
Yeah,
as we all
mean,
move forward.
Would suspect within, not within the next, month or two, we should have a final document that kind of outlines the review of that process that'll be available.
Great, thanks.
Anyone, questions?
I would expect that we'll just go through these pieces as we go through each chapter, that we'll revisit your analysis, as we go through each one.
Great. Tom?
Do we have to put in the charrette? See,
It got less than half a
Liz
page.
and Tom were not there at the charrette, so they don't know the bloodletting.
Is this 2012?
And Probably block,
2016.
probably block that year out.
Funny.
2016, I think.
Could have
16.
been worse about if we had it during happy hour.
I think they're Bourbon's problem.
Not the right document. Okay, so we've submitted a first draft of the Historic Resources chapter. I thought your 2012 version was pretty well written, and it had a lot of good material in it. So we were kind of speculating amongst ourselves how much of that you wanted to retain. And in my opinion, I think, the vast majority of it is worthy of being retained. And we can have that conversation tonight if you want. But that was the assumption we worked in, is you had a lot of good material from 2012. So that's the first part of this chapter, is we just carried it forth from 2012. The state does require you to have a brief history of the community, and I thought that one covered that territory fairly well.
Fabulous.
On page 3,
Yes.
Lovell's War, 1722 to 1725, it's 172.
Right, it's missing a digit.
We're missing a digit.
Oh, let me,
Oh, yeah, see that?
you got it? Okay, yeah.
1702?
1722 to 25 was the war. I wasn't there.
You were only there for what, a short time?
Cameo.
So up on the screen now is the components of the chapter. As I said, the first one, the brief history, we pretty much plagiarized the 2012 plan. Paul had a good comment in his email. He said that the fire of 1947 is worth noting, and I agree with him. So we'll be adding that in as well. Then the state, of course, is looking for, whoops, getting ahead of myself, demographic data, just a little timeline of how the town grew, and then sometimes then we'll get to that page in a few minutes. Then National Register of Historic Places. I started off at the Maine Historic Preservation Commission, and there's a lot of material that's not there. And the more I kind of dug around, the more I was finding. And I discovered that Kennebunkport has 11 different National Register nominations that were accepted, which is really high number for a town of this size. But it's not well known. If you go up to Augusta, they'll tell you about one or two or three of them. So the people were very busy back in the 1970s and 80s putting historic resources on the National Register. We'll also be talking about what that means to be on the register, the benefits of that. Then we go into a little architectural tour of the town. You've got a lot of great raw material here for that, and there's a lot of photographs in your chapter to illustrate that. Cemeteries, I was surprised you got close to 70 of them. Warren tells me that the Cemetery Commission has been very diligent in going out there and not only locating the cemeteries, but documenting who's there, which is important because particularly for the middle of the 19th century, the gravestones tend to be of white marble, and the acid rain really does a job on them. And it's just a matter of time before you can't read them anymore. See who's there. Then archaeological resources, the state, of course, is looking for that. And climate change, what are we, climate change is going to force us to take a kind of different look at how to deal with historic resources. So that's what I'm going to talk about in the next few minutes. And it's brief history. If I love this photograph here, just these, from left is Atwater Kent, Booth Tarkington, and Kenneth Roberts in 1924. And I'm enjoying learning a lot about the history. I didn't know much about Kenneth Roberts, and just last week I was sitting in a church in Portsmouth, and he was writing a novel about Roberts Rangers, which I'd heard about, but I just started to connect the dots with this photograph right here.
Slightly irascible.
Well, all three of them were. None of them. They were. They could look like they were, controlling the world there. And here's your population. It was a little surprise for me. I expected the big dip from 1840 down to 1930. You find that all over rural New England. But not as acute here in Kennebunkport as a lot of towns, and that's because the shipping industry kept a lot of people employed and kept them in town. What happened further inland and all across New Hampshire, Vermont, and western Massachusetts is started in the 1830s, and it did happen here. It just doesn't show up much on this graph because the shipbuilding industry kind of camouflaged what was going on. The farmers just got tired of trying to farm this place, and half of them picked up and went out to the Midwest. And that explains a lot of the population drop. This is, as mentioned before, the more I dug around, the more documented historic sites we have in town. 3 districts and 8 individual properties. Plus Historic American Building Survey. That was another one where I was surprised there were four buildings listed in they call it HABs for short. It was started in the 1930s, and during the Depression, Roosevelt put some architects to work, and they went around North America documenting the most historic buildings they could find. So they tend to be very well documented because the documentation was prepared by professional architects. Now, what's the significance of the National Register? Two things. Section 106 of the Historic Preservation Act of 1966 was enacted by Congress to protect us from federal agencies. In other words, they saw a lot of cases where federal agencies were not being careful when they were, building a highway or whatever they were doing. And so what that does is it forces federal agencies and state agencies who use federal funds and state agencies who require federal licenses to do whatever they're doing to be careful how they impact historic properties. And they decide whether you're a historic property by determining whether your property is eligible for listing on the National Register. So in 1975, whoever was generating the register here locally, it was a nomination for the village district and had 150 houses in it. When I first pulled the register from the state, it didn't tell the good part of the story. I went down to the archive in Washington, and they had all these memos, and it was back and forth between the state and Washington. And there was a difference of opinion. The state said this part of town is not eligible for the register. And the Fed said, well, we think it is. And there was back and forth, and the Feds conceded in the end. In 2014, the bridge needed to be replaced. And of course, the state was using federal funds to do that. And the whole issue came up again. And the state DOT, so we don't know whether it's eligible now. We don't have any data, because back in '75, they walked away from it. So the state had to hire a consultant to go out there and study this part of town, and the consultant concluded that it is eligible for the National Register. So whether you're listed or eligible, you still get the same protection from federal projects. Now, historic tax credits, which is the next subject down, that is something that may well be of interest to some folks in town, particularly this part of town. They're very generous tax credits for the rehabilitation of historic buildings, and both the federal government and the state offer them. The feds offer a 20% tax credit. So, for example, if you had that building and you were on the National Register and you needed to sink $100,000 into it, and it was approved by the National Park Service, you would get a $20,000 tax credit. So this is a very popular program. You have to be an income-producing property, and you have to be listed on the National Register. So that's a subject, you know, I think is well worth exploring, because I think the more people in this part of town learn about it, the more interested they're gonna be in taking advantage of that program.
Yeah, I did find it interesting how in your dialogue here, how somewhat subtly put, but you know, picked up on the fact that the state wasn't really impressed with Dock Square.
They're still not. And that's a funny
Except the
thing,
pharmacy.
is in 2014, they were still stuck in that same rut, you know?
This doesn't belong here. This is
Yeah,
Right,
the
right.
DOT brought in the consultant and said, hey, this is eligible, and the state responded, said, well, we don't think we have enough data to really decide yet, you know? And so they can't admit that they made the wrong call in 75, you know?
Yeah.
And the reason is one of the same people is still there, you know, so.
Yep. there you go.
Wow.
Now, the other thought I had, and this is kind of a novel, I'm gonna look into this more, is, you know, when Liz and I were here for the prelude, we were checking out the high water here, and this was really high. Not in this picture here, we didn't take this picture during the prelude, but boy, that was high when we were up here for the chili. And I'm thinking, you know, and I'm gonna investigate this further, but I'm thinking maybe people could use this tax credit program to raise up the building, you know? So make it more, provide more reward for actually doing something, make it more financially feasible, but it's something I'll look into.
Hurricane
Yeah,
would probably
it's-
like that.
Hurricane.
Yeah, they flood every year.
It's somewhat of a debate, you know, I mean, we've talked a little bit about this, you know, in particular with Dock Square and how that translates to the streetscape. You know, you start elevating buildings here, and it starts to create, you know,
Yes.
create some ADA issues, it creates a change in the streetscape, and how do you manage that? Now, because these are commercial properties, I mean, you could flood-proof them in place, but you're basically just creating a bathtub. You know, if you
Yeah.
try to flood-proof one of,
Yeah.
you know, one of these buildings, then
Yeah.
they're just gonna pop off the pilings.
Right.
So it's got a unique set of problems that,
It does indeed, and you know, when I first looked at it, I said,
Yeah.
geez, how are you gonna fix this? But
Yeah.
right, but I do think it's something that,
Let the
you know,
next
whether
owner deal with
whether it's something
next
that's
owner deal with it.
mentioned in the historical piece, but also, you know, carries through into, you know, into the climate change discussion, or,
Yeah.
I don't know, somewhere else, like, there needs to be, I think, some type of, plan, and that's developed, or at least recommendations that are developed on, for how to deal with this.
How long have those been flooding?
Hmm?
How long have those been flooding?
How long have they been
How long?
flooding?
Yeah.
I mean, I've seen them, you know.
Like how long's the hurricane actually had water come through it? Just curious.
Hurricane Restaurant?
Yeah.
Not very much. I think it was just recent.
I think the worst one was 2 years ago, and
Yeah.
then they
2 years ago.
renovated it, and then
Happened
a week
again.
later, there was another
Right.
flood.
Yeah, yeah,
And a year later, it was sold.
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, we've had it over, yeah,
I
I'd
don't know if
say,
it was like stories, it's just always like cause they just put it at that level and it's always been a problem.
no, I would say, I mean, definitely, you know, within the past 5 years, I think we've certainly been more aware of it, you
Yeah.
know, and it's
Very
just
much.
been,
Storms have
No.
been more fierce and
yeah, you know, and, I mean, we've seen it more, we've consistently seen it in the marinas further on down towards
Yeah.
the mouth of the river.
Yeah.
You know, they've always experienced.
The road closures.
Right.
Ocean
Yeah, the road
Avenue.
Ocean
closures down
Avenue.
Ocean
Dyke
Ave.
Road.
I mean, those
Yeah.
have been pretty
Constantly.
consistent, you know, over the, you know, I can say over the past 12 to 15 years, that's been pretty consistent. As far as what the water levels have been.
So, now that we've introduced the National Register, let's go back and look at this map. This is all National Register, by the way, but as I'm sure you know, there's another type of historic district, and we did address that in the chapter, and that's the local historic district, and it's quite different. The local historic district means that the municipality would form a historic preservation commission, and anyone who's in that district would have to seek prior approval before altering the exterior of their property. Some towns and cities in Maine, it's long established, others don't want anything to do with it. I noticed, reading some of the comments in 2012 plan, that the idea has been floated here in Kennebunkport before, and not everybody was in favor of it. So that's, at some point, we'd like to take some direction from the growth planning committee, is whether you want to put that up for consideration again or not. So we're not proposing it here in this chapter yet. If it's someplace you want to go, we can go there. If you think it's not wise, we can certainly take our direction from you on that count. But I just want to make sure that everybody's clear. There's a huge difference between the local district and the federal. The federal, I think, has no disadvantages. I mean, the federal, if you're in the federal district, you can do anything you want to your home. You can tear it down if you want. All the federal district does is provide benefits, provides the tax credits if you're income producing, provides protection from federal agencies, and it probably enhances your resale value too, being able to brag that you're on the National Register. So those are two different animals. All the time people get them mixed up, so I just want to make sure that we were all clear about the difference, because there will be people come and say, I don't want to be in the National Register because they're going to make me paint my house a certain color. That's just not the way it is.
Right. Yeah, we were talking a little bit about this. I think one of the issues that came up, I think, as I understand it, the last time around was this, was the perception, of what the regulatory setup would look like. I think it's important to note how Kennebunk deals with its historic district. It's that exact fear of, well, I don't want to have to go to a committee to figure out what color I can paint my house, and
Or even what kind of bush to plant.
right. There's some, so I think that's what probably deep sixed it, the last time.
I understand it. I live in the historic district in Portsmouth, and I don't like being in the historic district much, but I'm really glad that my next door neighbor is. Because I know what he would do to that building.
Yeah.
For some reason, though, if you take it all in, we haven't been affected by,
Right.
the whimsical, I'm going to tear this house down and build a modern.
Well, and that's been the interesting part, because I've had other communities contact me to say, well, what is it that you're, can you give us a copy of the regs that you have for the, a historical district of town? And I said, well, great. I said, it's really easy. What is it? I said, it's nothing, other than standard zoning. And it's, well, how is that possible that, that nothing happens? So the only thing that I can, that I factor in is that, the market is such that folks who purchase these properties purchase them specifically for the historical value. I mean, that's a big consideration, and that, as they do renovations, they do them in such a fashion that are pretty, that are, I don't want to say necessarily historically accurate, but they, they complement the house as opposed to detracting from it,
Yeah. And I agree with you, Werner.
Now,
I'm not
now
sure
that
what
I've
you're-
said it, someone's
yeah.
gonna.
I'm not sure what the magic formula here that's making you successful in that way, but
Luck,
I think it's the appeal of
Pure
people
luck.
who
I
want
think,
water.
yes,
Right.
yeah, I think it can change.
Oh, yeah.
that oddball
Could.
person hasn't come by yet.
Yeah, and
Right.
sometimes the greatest danger is people with too much money, because then they feel compelled to really go to town,
a lot of those.
True.
So, so at some point, I guess Liz and I would just like some direction as to how you want to handle the local historic district question, whether we're gonna, say, okay, we thought about it, but we're not gonna go there, or whatever you wanna do,
I thought we did have a historic document. I have one. Maybe I shouldn't.
A historic document.
Well, it's by that I mean, it's like a historic area management, but I didn't think we had one, so I've never even pulled it out.
Well, we have the National Historic Register that Kim Lovejoy did of the
Is that-
houses.
is that what we have?
This area and Cape Arundel. That's probably what you have.
That's probably what I have. Do you need that? Because we have,
It sounds like a National Register nomination. Is that what?
You've probably seen it.
Yeah,
I have it.
we'll certainly,
if it's something
Have a look
other,
at
I'd be
Yeah, I
interested in
have
having a look.
oh, you're just,
Yeah.
two.
Don't leave home without history. That's what you have.
Yes, that's what I have.
Right.
Yep.
And what's the title of that?
Kennebunkport Historical Committee Final Report.
And then Kim Lovejoy's report of all the buildings.
Okay.
Cape Arundel doesn't contribute. I always love those.
Yep, and then it goes into the different buildings.
Okay, I
There's
would.
probably some valuable
I
information.
would like to have a look at that, yeah. So, then we did part of the chapter is just a little tour around your historic district, all the different types of architecture you have there, and you have quite a fun variety,
we do.
you know. This is, you all recognize the building on the top here.
Yeah.
The Knott building,
Knott building.
1853. And in the bottom right is the Parthenon in Athens, 438 BC. And what's really impressive about the Knott House is just how meticulous they were to the detail and the proportions. You don't see that anymore, but back then they were just like, we got to make it exactly like the Parthenon, you know? And they did. And over on the left is what they didn't realize is that over 2,000 years, all the paint wore off the Parthenon, and the Parthenon wasn't really white to begin with, but they didn't know that.
Well, they went true to the red color with the roof.
No, so that's why all these Greek revival buildings in New England were all white, because they didn't realize that the paint had worn off. They're sitting out in their ship, you know, and looking at the Parthenon on the hill, you know, and it's the sun is glistening off it, and it just was white, you know.
Yeah.
So they said that's what the Greeks did. The Greeks painted all their buildings white, you know. So we have to do the same thing. And it wasn't until recent years that they realized the real colors are on the left there.
Probably just as well.
Some people might like the white.
Right. Yeah.
So just based on the two National Register Historic Districts, those documents kind of documented exactly how many buildings of each style are in the districts. So those 300 buildings that's representing in this chart here, and Kennebunkport is well represented in most of the architectural styles dominated American. The town, for some reason, did not go in much at all for the Italian Age or the French Second Empire or the Queen Anne. They're hard to come by, but just down the road in Kennebunkport, you see some fabulous examples of those. So, shingle style, that's where the town stands out. There aren't too many towns that have, you know, quite a great number of first-class buildings in that style. It was very popular at the end of the 19th century, and what makes it special and significant, it was the first time in history in the United States where the Americans stopped copying the Europeans. They said, we're gonna grow our own architecture, and this is the first time they did it. Everything before then was like, let's copy Paris, let's copy London, let's see what the Europeans are doing. The only other place you'll find a lot of shingle styles is at Bar Harbor and Newport, and there's quite a few in York as well. Cemeteries, as I said, the Cemetery Commission has accumulated quite a bit of good information, and we will incorporate all of that into the plan. I mean, there's still a lot left to do, but I'm sure they're going to get there eventually. But you look at the map on the left, most of them, they're family graveyards. And because of family graveyards, in many cases, the families aren't there anymore. The graveyards kind of get lost in the woods, you know. Prehistoric archaeological sites. The state requires us to include this in the plan. They've identified 4 of them. They don't tell anybody exactly where they are because they're afraid there'll be souvenir hunters going out there looking for arrowheads and things. But they give you the 4 general locations where they have reason to believe that there are sites. Which, and as you can see, all 4 locations, as we would expect, are down by the shore. Because the Native Americans who lived in New England, they tended to come to the shore in the summer and camp out there for the summer and fish and collect shellfish. And the evidence of them being there are typically, you know, the tools and the leftover the shells from the shellfish, yeah. Now, this brings up another issue. We haven't, I haven't seen any evidence that the state's really on top of this yet. But as the sea rises, these sites are going to go underwater. You know? So up until now, the state of Maine has said, if you know there's an archaeological site, what you should do is just protect it, keep somebody from destroying it. But until we have money to go excavate it properly and find out what's there, well, I think the time is now to kind of pick up the pace, you know, because once it goes underwater, they're not going to be able to.
Conservation Trust is doing quite a bit on that.
That is, I know that, that is very good.
Yeah.
That is,
Yeah.
I was really surprised and pleased to see that.
Yeah.
Which is-
We've
Yeah,
already lost
I
one
thought that was a
cemetery.
nice ad with the dugout canoe
Yes.
Yeah.
information in
Yeah.
there.
Yeah.
I thought
Yeah,
that was a good ad.
that was very cool.
Yep.
But we have lost one cemetery. The cemetery at Stage Island
Yes.
is gone.
Mhm. So it's interesting, you know, if you go at the state regulations for comprehensive plans, they'll say that's that's a state policy, is you've got to preserve the archaeological site. Well, they need to revisit that, you know, they got to change that. No, we can't just preserve all of them.
Yeah,
We got to do something about the ones that are threatened by the ocean. Historic archaeological sites. Maine Historic Preservation Commission maintains a list. The state says you gotta incorporate all of that into your comprehensive plan. You did in 2012, but since 2012, the list has grown about 4-fold. So there's quite a few more of them. This list came from the Historic Preservation Commission. And this is what Barbara was just referring to. Imagine all of you know what happened last summer. Yeah.
Isn't that a movie?
What happened last night?
What
I
happened
know
last
what you
summer
did
is-
last
is, this is, I was surprised, you know, to discover this. And it's so cool it's
Amazing.
being done by volunteers. They knew enough to go down there. They know that, you know, the climate's changing, the tidal zone is doing things that it wasn't doing before. And they knew to look for stuff, and they found it. What they're excavating right there is a dugout canoe, 700 years old. The oldest one has been discovered in Maine, one of only 4. And it's the only one that predates the Europeans. So these folks here, they get it. This is the time to be taking action along the shore for archaeological resources. And this is where we start just giving some thought to the effects of climate change and the sea rising. There'll be some buildings you really want to save and get them out of harm's way. A lot of them aren't worth the effort or the money. This is a picture of a house that wasn't escaping climate change. It was escaping urban renewal in Portsmouth. And the owner of the building, if he had left it in the north end, it would have been destroyed. And so he wanted to move it to the south end. And such a big house. It's built in 1760. He would have had trouble getting it down the streets of Portsmouth, so they put it out in a barge in the river. And the other lesson to be drawn here is, up until about 1850, the buildings were built in post and beam, and they were very strong, very durable. After that, they started being constructed with balloon frame construction, like down in Dock Square. Exactly, yeah, and so those are going to be much more difficult, more expensive. to move, and maybe it's not worth it. But this is the type of thing that the town has to start thinking about, is what's gonna be worth saving and what's feasible to move, you know. You don't see too many of these houses going down the river on a barge, but back in the 19th century, it was surprising. They moved houses all the time, not by sea usually, but the post and beam were one of their advantages, where they were fairly easy to move.
My house and my house next to me on School Street were once in front of the Captain Lord Mansion. And
Yeah.
he wanted a better view of the river. So those houses got picked up and
Oh, yeah, yeah.
From
Well,
building to School Street.
back then, it was, it was cheaper to move somebody else, move an old house than to build a new one, And they'd have to wait till the ground was frozen. They'd get a lot of oxen out
Right.
there, and away they went,
The 1802 house came down from Waterboro on Lock Street.
wow.
Yeah,
I didn't know that.
that's a
Yeah.
trip.
So those,
Down the turnpike?
Yes, yeah.
so here's some of the key issues that I think are worth thinking about, talking about, contemplating. We already talked about, how do you want to handle the local historic district issue? Inventory of resources outside National Register District. This is something the state is encouraging us to do in the Comprehensive Plan Regulations, Chapter 208. I've seen no evidence that it's been done here. I think it's a good idea, and it's also a good idea in terms of preparing for climate change. Even if you're going to lose some of these historic resources, what you should at least do is document what's out there, so you know what you've lost, and so there's some record of it.
When you're suggesting a documentation, is that beyond what is already, what's listed in that list of 70 locations?
Well, that would be for cemetery, yeah. I think you guys are right on top of cemeteries. What I've seen no evidence of is a townwide survey of historic buildings. We've seen, the Cape Arundel is well documented, the village is well documented, Dock Square is now well documented. But other than that, the rest of town is kind of like,
They stopped, like the townhouse school and
yeah,
the church, the first church. None of those are included in the historic.
yeah. And when I say documented, we won't necessarily find any more properties that are gonna be eligible for the National Register. But when I say documented, it's just taking pictures and noting what's there, how old the house is, the style, a little bit of the history. And this is actually fairly common. A lot of cities and towns have done this. The state is encouraging you to do it.
So what's the cutoff typically as far as the age?
National Register, it's 50 years. If you're doing a survey of your historic resources, you can define that however you like. But the 50 years is a federal cutoff. So,
I'm almost eligible to be on the National Register.
Let's not go there.
Next, please.
Buildings.
It's kind of sobering when you realize that
Saying 50 years is not.
you're old enough now to be eligible for the registry.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
That seemed like a long time once upon a time. So.
On twice over.
The other thing about the townwide survey is it's not a terribly expensive thing, you can.
Oh, right, I mean, that's what I'm just I'm asking about
Yeah,
the
footwork.
threshold. I mean, a lot of the, actually year-built data is data that the town has, and so to some degree, it can be a matter of running a report that pulls a lot of that data out. And a lot of those already have pictures associated with them that we have. They're just not set aside in a separate inventory
Yeah.
like that.
Well, that's good that you have that material, but.
Well, this is just pulling out of the assessing data.
Yeah.
We can run reports pulling up what actual year built is. And, couple that if it's identified as an antique, in
Right.
terms of a building style. And there's a picture usually associated with each one of them.
Yeah, I read in 1975 or so, the Historical Society, they decided to create placards for a lot of houses.
Yeah.
And as I understand it, they did a lot of the homework, they did some research to
They
make
did.
sure they were getting it right.
Right.
My experience with assessors data is the assessors just kind of taking a wild guess, that they don't really know. Just the assessor data I've looked at, they're not historians, they're architectural historians. So,
Yeah.
the work the Historical Society did, I think, is probably pretty reliable. You have to double check the assessor.
So is that something that you just wind up showing in as a recommendation as far as the creation of an inventory? I mean, it's not something that finds itself in the actual plan.
That's correct, and one of the state's strategies, when I say the state's encouraging you to do it, that's the strategy, they said you should do this. If you agree with that, then, you know, you can put it in a plan and say, yeah, we think this is good. We think it should be done in the near term, because it's not gonna cost a lot of money. And, you know, sometimes houses burn down and stuff happens, you know, and then you're glad you had that record.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, so then I thought I'd go quickly through what the state is requiring you to do for this chapter. Here's the part about preserving the historic and archaeological resources. And then they're telling us what kind of data we need to collect in order to satisfy the state's requirements. They have 7 different files on their website. We've downloaded all 7 of them. We've gone much further than that already. The state, what they require you to do isn't very much. But, for example, they want you to document the National Register districts, but there's only 2 of them on their website, and we've already have 11 nominations.
Yeah.
Here's your brief history of Kennebunkport. That's in the chapter, so that's done. Here's where they're asking us to do an inventory. And this is the assumption here is that the inventory is townwide. And that's what we were just talking about a moment ago. I don't think that's been done. And then number 4 is a brief description of threats. I thought I'd throw that question to the committee, because I don't, other than the sea rising up higher, I don't see any threats here in town, but maybe you guys have some insights on that.
What was that again?
The state wants us to talk about the historic resources and what types of things might threaten them. In some towns, it's like, you know, commercial development is just kind of coming in there or something, you know. Or they're people are tearing down houses for some reason. Well, I've seen no evidence of that here.
Yeah.
But maybe there are other threats
They
that,
do.
yeah, that I haven't seen yet. So. So these are the analyses the state requires us to do. Historic patterns of sediment still evident? I would say absolutely. What protective measures exist for historic archaeological? Your land use regulations are fairly good in that respect. If somebody wants to come in and do a big subdivision, they've got to check with Augusta to make sure that there's not a archaeological resources right in the middle there that they, you know, might get bulldozed. Just number 3 is.
Do you know that?
It's kind of a similar to number 2. And when I had a question, I noticed the zoning and the subdivision regs are pretty good in this regard. What about if somebody's going through the site plan review process? Is there some similar provision that would, like, you know, protect a historic resource or archaeological resource?
No, not typically in a site plan, a site plan review process. It's not, it's not something that's listed on the checklist. And,
Yeah.
but I think if there's an inventory that's available, I mean, that's ultimately the question goes is, well, where do you go to the resource? I mean, I think if it is something that if we wind up with a resource document that has it listed, then that's a fairly easy add.
Yeah.
Then at some point in the future to say, check the inventory that the town has and maintain,
Right.
make sure that it's not, that you're not disturbing some type of.
Yeah.
you know, historically significant property.
Because I noticed the subdivision regs have that covered, you know. It's kind of, the language says, if you have any knowledge of something historic there, you've got to take that into account. You know.
Yeah.
Have significant historic resources fallen into disrepair? I haven't seen much evidence of that either. Maybe you guys can shed some light on that.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's, you know, I'm not, you know,
I think we're relying on peer pressure. I do.
Private property is private property.
What do you think when John Summers bought the, what did he call it? Well, it's now the Cape Arundel Inn or whatever they're calling it today, but when he bought that, there was all kinds of comments.
So these are the minimum policies that the state requires it, and to protect to the greatest extent practical. And I think the town's done a pretty good job in that respect. This is what I was just talking to Werner about a moment ago. Your land use regulations cover it fairly well. It's both in the zoning, it's also in the shoreline protection part of the zoning as well as the subdivision regs. Incorporate the maps that we can get from the Historic Preservation Commission. We've done that, and then more. We've gotten some more maps from elsewhere. And number 3 is what we were talking about before, a townwide inventory of historic resources. So once again, they're kind of sending a signal to us that's what they'd like you to do. And then the rest of these slides are, I just pulled them out of the land use ordinance verbatim. Shows you what the town has already done, which you covered fairly well.
What was that last one? Shoreline one?
Yeah.
yeah, the key point is identifying it in a comprehensive plan first. If it's not identified in a comp plan, then it's pretty tough for the planning board to check that box off that says
Right.
that, yes, it's protected.
Yeah, right, that's where I think a townwide survey would be a useful tool. Contract zoning, provision contract zoning, and one of the criteria is, don't mess around with the historic sites. Shoreland, that's something that the state requires you to do anyways. And your subdivision regs, we were talking about this before. If you have knowledge of anything historic being out there, you have to take into account and work around it. And that's the slideshow. So,
Very well done.
Yeah.
thank you.
So is the intent that this document actually encompasses a couple different chapters really combined here? So this is, because I think we have the archaeological chapter as well as kind of the history.
Yeah, if you compare this with the 2012, you realize that we've kind of combined 3 chapters into one.
Yeah.
And we just thought it made sense, if you're gonna tell a history of Kennebunkport, it just follows logically that the historic resources would, segue right in there.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think it's a logical combination of it, It's my only thought is that be interesting to see the state's reaction, to the combining of chapters. I think that'll just take some education on their part. I think you get some reviewers that are gonna look specifically for, well, where's this chapter, and this chapter. But I think for something it gets submitted.
Yeah, well, we're paying close attention to chapter 2A. We wanna make sure we get
Yeah.
all the content that the state's looking for.
Yep.
And from some of the other comprehensive plans we've seen in other cities and towns in Maine, at least these days, the state reviewers aren't too fussy about how you arrange things.
Right, as long as the content's
Yeah,
covered.
as long as it's
Yep.
in there.
So it looks all we have to do is kind of fill in the blanks a little bit, and we're all done?
Well,
That's what we paid
have a
for.
few issues here, you know, raised. The state also.
How many chapters do we have?
A lot. And we anticipate that a lot of the others won't be as long as this, you know. This one just lent it so well to illustrations and photographs, that
Yeah.
this is gonna be longer than some of the others you'll see. One topic that the state raises too in 208 is a program called Certified Local Governments. We mentioned this briefly in a paragraph just to acknowledge that we know about it, but it's a federal program in which they channel federal grants to the local Historic Preservation Commission for various projects. My experience is the grants are very small, but sometimes, you know, it's still a popular program because in a lot of, particularly the smaller towns, even if it's not enough money, it's enough money to, you know, do something worthwhile. And it keeps coming every year. The prerequisite for being a certified local government is you have to have a local historic district. So I just mentioned that just so you know one goes with the other. If you don't go with the local historic district, and I'm guessing that the town probably won't, then certified local government is not an option for you. But the state requires us to address it, so it is mentioned in there. So that's why it's mentioned, if you wondered why it's just kind of floating in there.
So we could still have a historic district with not too much control over it.
A local historic, yes, you can do that. In fact, most of them, they don't tell you what color to paint your house.
That's the first thing that comes up? Right.
Liz went to
Can't
school
change my windows to
in
insulate, they're gonna be cold.
Durham, New Hampshire. There's
That's right.
these three buildings in Durham
Yeah.
that
Gotta put single
are in the
panes
historic
in.
district, and the story is that the fellow got into a disagreement with the town over being told what color to paint his house, so he picked some really ugly colors.
Okay.
That sounds about right.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, the closest that we came to, you know, in terms of having a performance standard, if you look in, you know, we have a section where we deal with non-conforming lots of record. And, you know, I think it's enough language that when architects look at it, they understand what not to design for these lots, as opposed to being real specific about, you know, having a real defined set of performance standards. But it was you know, it was the response to when we started seeing some more modern architecture show up down at the beach, and you know, where we had a lot of folks that you know, had a lot of concerns about, you know, modern architecture down on the beachfront, and so, you know, we responded with, you know, essentially a requirement that, you know, roofs have a certain amount of pitch to them over at least 50% of the roof area, and that the style needed to be of a style that was similar to something that was already existing in the neighborhood. Some, again, pretty general language, but, and it was really intended more to, you know, let designers know what not to do, as opposed to getting real specific in the weeds of how to design a house on these lots. But at the time, we chose to apply it to non-conforming lots of record because, you know, when we look at it in town, that's really, you know, the majority of those areas are on all the main streets. You know, I mean, downtown, mostly non-conforming lots of record. Goose Rock's Beach, non-conforming. Cape Porpoise, non-conforming, you know. So all of those areas that people drive through and see are in those areas. So we didn't specifically define based on a map, but we knew where we were whenever we defined it. But with the thought that if you had a conforming lot of record and you were, you know, out, you know, not necessarily on the main drag, if you wanted to build a unique modern architecture, that was your prerogative then, as long as you met all the other requirements, so. So that's how the town's responded so far, you know, with that element as far as architecture in those types of areas. It seems to have worked so far, but, you know, without getting hung up in the weeds, so.
I just wanted to jump back to Jim's comment on us being done. Just to reiterate, because I know everyone in here knows that we're not done with this chapter, but since there are people watching at home, we're going to go through a process of looking at your recommendations from the 2012 plan and developing a set of recommendations and strategies for this plan. Once we're through developing the initial drafts and through some of our more intensive public input sessions. So we'll have the opportunity to address some of the key issues and get some more public input, and then use all the information we've collected to draft up recommendations. So, so we will be adding more content to potentially this chapter, but also our implementation and recommendations section. So, so right now it is a great existing conditions chapter. So.
And at that time, that would be a good time to gather information on the local historic district. Is there any interest or?
Yes, yeah.
Before it's cast in stone and voted down.
Yeah, so in between now and then, we're always collecting
Yeah.
input from either through Werner, through the committee, at these meetings, through the website. There's an opportunity to provide comments, so if there are comments that people want to send in, issues that they want highlighted, we have plenty of time to collect that information sort of informally ad hoc,
Yes.
and then during our public input workshops, we'll be doing it sort of a more intensive process. But we do want to make sure we capture, you know, any hot topics. We get a chance for everyone to weigh in on those.
I don't remember if that was a question that was addressed in the survey. I don't think it was
I don't
addressed
think-
specifically
I don't
in the,
think it was.
so we gave you all the survey results that updated community survey, but I don't think that was, I don't know that the idea of, you know, having historic, building regs, was.
I don't
something that was
remember
addressed.
that. No, do you
No,
remember that, Tom?
I don't think that was.
Probably would
Yep.
have been a good idea, though. In
Should have asked
retrospect.
that question.
And times may have changed too. I just noticed in here that the committee was appointed by the selectmen in 2001, and they submitted their report in 2002. And that's when it was voted down.
Okay. So where do we go from here? What's our next step?
Our next step is, we will be sending you all another chapter for our next meeting.
Okay.
And we have an updated schedule. At the beginning of this process, we gave you like a 2-page handout with
Yeah.
sort of a, here's what's coming,
Yeah.
list of chapters and meetings, which I forgot to print out, so I will email it to you, so that you know what's on deck. We're working on land use, demographics, housing, I think are the next 3 that we'll be covering. And Tom, you're also working on an introduction to the plan.
Excellent.
So that's sort of where we're at, and we're hoping that we'll be able to cover a chapter every meeting to sort of stay on our schedule. Obviously, we might need to be a little flexible with that approach if there's a lot of hot topics, and, you know, issues and new information that we need to discuss with you all and incorporate into the chapter, but that's where we're at now, so.
I think it's really important that we do, as committee members, take the time to review these before we walk in. We shouldn't be looking at this the moment you
Nope.
walk in. You should have really digested, made notes, asked questions, whatever, So we have really excellent dialogue on each chapter as we do it. Okay, Barbara?
So you're saying homework?
Yes, sure.
Homework.
Right.
Homework.
I mean, overall, just, I was impressed with the amount of information that
Yeah.
that you
Incredible
pulled
amount.
together.
Yeah,
You know, I read through this piece and
Yep.
said, where did they find half of this?
Oh,
So,
Tom gets the credit for this chapter.
Where's this thing leading, huh?
yeah, so, I mean, it was, a lot of good information
Yeah.
here. One of the things that did come up just, again, at the amount of information that's here, and, my question is, I don't know if we need 50 pages of information for, for this piece, but it's, I think it's up to the committee to make that call. I mean, it is 3 chapters worth, so you think of it that way. If
Yeah.
it's 3 chapters worth, then it's not as, it's not as imposing, in terms of the amount of info. But I do think that's something that we need to bring back to Tom and Liz about, content, is it,
Well, I think one of the things we spoke about was using more pictures and bullet points and
Yeah.
things like
Yeah.
that. Is there any way we could take some of that, voluminous text and, kind of boil it down into more easily readable?
Well,
So,
we will be preparing the sort of second portion of the comprehensive plan, which is sort of the, executive summary, volume 2, which is going to be more graphics and sort of a very condensed, high-level summary of all of the chapters.
Yeah.
okay.
So that'll be
Yeah.
a short document, but that content won't really substitute for the full chapter.
Right.
So,
Well, I'd hate to lose any of it.
that's right,
Yeah.
yeah, and that's not what I'm suggesting at all, but
There might be a
It's a good-
different
it's a
way of
good point. I
presenting it,
think-
but I don't want to lose it.
I think,
And part of it's driven by chapter 208, they have certain things, and that's taken up a considerable amount of that space.
yeah,
Yeah.
but we can all kind of review it again and look for, there's a couple tables that could go in an appendix. You
Right.
wouldn't necessarily lose it, but, someone would have to go find it if they
Yeah.
wanted to
that's
look
right,
at
if
it.
they really wanted it.
That kind of thing.
Yeah.
I think we like incorporating the maps and
Yes.
images
Yeah.
in the
Yeah,
text
certainly.
because it's really hard to figure out what's going on when you can't just
Yep.
Yeah.
easily reference it.
I think this is good use of the pictures and,
Yeah.
and everything that goes with it.
Absolutely.
You're not gonna find,
There's a
you're not
lot.
gonna find it as easy to do this in the other chapters. And I think it's
Yeah.
great to
Yeah.
have this in here, even if it is 50 pages.
Right.
It's almost a standalone book about the history of
Yeah.
the town. I think
Yeah.
it's wonderful.
And it is 3 chapters. They were
Yeah.
29 pages.
Okay. Good start,
Yeah.
Excellent.
very good start. Very very impressive. You do this for a living?
That's what we do.
What do you do?
Okay, so I think we have questions to think about, for the next meeting, in particular, the historic district idea. So I think it would be good to give some thought to that and come back with some, some thoughts on what that may or may not look
Yeah.
like. The historical committee report, I heard that's something that you want to get a copy of. So we need to get a copy of that. I might have to borrow that
if he-
from you to
if he-
scan it.
If he
I have it,
promises,
I'll
Yeah.
bring it into you.
if he promises to bring it back, he can borrow
Well,
the book.
I don't know how I got
Warren,
it.
if you have a digital copy that, no, do you, or?
Probably not.
Probably
I can-
not.
I can make a
Yeah.
digital copy.
Yeah, I mean, we can scan it, that's not a
Yeah.
problem, yeah,
Why don't you just scan it
yeah,
and?
okay.
Just one or two, just to
We don't own a copy of it.
No,
tag onto that.
I
would
have,
love
I have
a
a copy too.
well, thank you, Barbara, anyway.
Yeah. I have to hold it in my hand.
Yeah.
I'd like to have more discussion on that primarily to educate myself more on that, the historical part and
Right.
what that means,
When's our next meeting?
the what ifs, the pros and cons,
Yeah.
and what it really means is,
I mean, I think
I think educating.
it's one of those
Being
things that you can
educated.
make it, you know, to some degree with a local, you can make it what you want, you know, I mean, it can be as simple as having a recognition of an area as being historic without any, you know, without any regs in it, just a recognition of it. And, you know, like, it can be
Yeah,
from one spectrum to the other, so
Yeah.
I think that's really, I think that's what they need to hear, I think that's what needs to be part of the discussion, you know, is to what
right.
level.
Be interested in getting education, even identifying that, what it means, what changes could be beyond or be down the road by even
Right.
saying, God, there's not that much here, but that doesn't necessarily mean that
Yeah.
there's the open ability to change something down
Yeah.
Yeah.
the road.
I mean, like anything
By
else, you know, I
accepting
think,
that recognition.
you know, I suspect, you know, the first blush recommendation of it was pretty intense. You know, I don't think if, had it been, you know, kind of light, fluffy and benign, that it would have met the resistance that it did,
Yeah.
so.
The city of Portsmouth used to have two local historic districts. They were called A and B. A is the one you didn't really want to live in yourself, because then the city told you what you couldn't do. But B had only one restriction, and that is you can do anything you want to your house except you can't tear it down. So that's an example of, you know, a historic district that is really kind of light on the regulation.
Well, that's like ours.
Well, ours
We can
doesn't-
tear it down after so many days.
That's
Yeah.
right, ours doesn't prohibit it, it just, you know, it's,
Stalls.
right.
Yeah,
It
yeah.
provided enough notice out there so that, you know, folks would have opportunity if they wanted to move it. You know, I think, you know, that was the intent of it. It gave enough notice so that if interested parties wanted to buy it before it was torn down, they could, you know, negotiate a move. But,
Thank you.
and then also I have on, kind of on my list is to get you copies of the 03 and the 05 plans that
Yes, that would be.
went down in flames.
Is it going to be obvious to us why they went down in flames, or are we going to need a little summary or?
I'm not talking.
I mean, I have a general sense, but it's all just, you know, I mean, I wasn't here for either one of them.
Uh-huh.
It was heated.
But, you know, I think that, you know, at the end of the day, I think, you know, some of the biggest issues were, well, I think there were two issues. One I think was the composition of the committee at the time. You know, it's nothing like voting for a plan based on who sits on the committee. You know? And two, I think the other thing was the land use chapter. You know, I mean, there were some pretty dramatic recommendations in the land use chapter that just, that met with significant resistance, so.
Now you got me curious or anything. Do you have a minute to tell us what it was?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think, you know, there were, you know, generally in a rural area, it was suggestions of going from 3 acres to 10 acres for minimum lot size requirements, I think was probably the big kicker, you know, that probably deep sixed it, you know.
That was, I would say that was the primary
Yeah,
reason.
It's
I
yours.
attended the meeting at Goose Rocks.
yeah, you know, and I don't think it was from what I understood, it wasn't a surprise, you know, I mean, folks were upset about it, and I mean, there was opportunity, I think, to revise it, but just nobody budged, so.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, contentious enough to the point that, that this committee was, I don't wanna say it wasn't disbanded, but it was, the majority of the members resigned, you know, after that 2005.
Well, we held a
committee
vote the
was left.
following year to find out if we were going to even continue a growth planning committee.
Right,
So that can tell you something about the, yeah. It was decidedly heated.
yeah, so,
And the proponents of the 10 acres, was their goal to preserve open space, or? Forrest, or what was driving it?
Yeah, I mean, I suspect, I mean, it's probably a little bit of all of that, it was, I suspect it was, it was fear of large-scale subdivisions, you had recently had a couple of what I would say were large subdivisions for Kennebunkport. They're not large in the scheme of, even in the state of Maine, they're not large, but for this town, they were large, and I think that, when folks see that kind of development happening and you have one or two that happen in relatively quick succession behind each other, then, I think that's probably what drove a lot of the fear, was the concern that the rural areas of town were going to turn into, all of a sudden, all of those, So, I think that's probably what drove some of it. But then you have the property owner, and in particular, you had property owners who, old families that had, kids, grandkids, and, the effect of that certainly would be devastating, would have been devastating for, because many of those families had that land in mind, for the future generations to split lots off for their kids and grandkids, so.
10 acres is a big lot.
Yeah, so I mean, I think it was, certainly it was a compelling enough issue that it, caused the whole plan to fail. But
But Kennebunk they have a 10-acre minimums out in the Alewife section, out in the west Kennebunk area, where you might have 200-acre parcels, and they can still put a subdivision in there, even with 10-acre minimums.
So yeah, so that's,
Yep.
it's my,
Okay, we'll look forward to that.
that's my quick understanding of
I don't think they have the
of what
ledge,
did
though,
it.
that we have.
Or
No,
the value, higher value.
Okay. Any other business? Thank you very much, by the way.
Yeah.
That was an excellent
Well done.
presentation and review session. Any other business?
Just the confirmation of the next meeting calendar. I have, so in our
28th.
schedule, we were doing 2nd and 4th, so that would put us at
28th.
the 28th.
Yes. Does that work for everybody? Mm-hmm. Okay.
Did Dan say, I think he's the only one, I don't know if you wanna, did he say by email he won't make it?
I don't think I had anything from him on the 28th.
I think Dan said he could be here for the next meeting,
Oh, yeah.
next
Yeah.
two meetings,
Oh,
That's
okay,
right.
good.
which is a joy. He really knows what's going on. I'm just a fill-in.
They're not running the Knot House?
Yes, I keep everybody smiling while no work gets done. Okay, and hearing no other, we have our date for the next meeting already done. Any motion to,
I'll make a motion to adjourn.
thank you. That's it, just a motion, no second or anything.
I can second my own, I don't think I can, I can try.
I second.
Thank you. Okay, all those in favor? Okay, we are adjourned at 8:20.